refining our knowledge of what happened back 150 years ago this year in the Black Hills after this expedition, during this expedition. So I appreciate your attention to that. And for those of you who I haven't met, I've been a photographer over in South Dakota for over 40 years. Worked in newspapers and the tourism department, and then I've been freelancing since about 1990 with my wife Camille, doing books and magazine articles and that sort of thing back in the day. But I do a lot of scenic photography as well. Love, Mount Rushmore, of course, or landmarks there. But I've always been fascinated by history, as I know many of you are. This is up on, I think, the older was. I don't know if anybody know if this is still there. Can we recognize this? It's up by Aladdin on Oak Road, I believe it's called. And this is along the route of the Custer Expedition, so that's one reason I shot this. But it kind of represents that history to me. And about 20 years ago, I stumbled onto a technique which I did not invent, but I've learned to refine it, I think, quite a bit. And that's called rephotography. And that's simply placing your camera exactly where somebody did, 100 years ago or more. I've seen examples of this going back into the 1920s, actually. Somebody did try to stand where Custer's photographer did at a couple locations and take a picture of the campsite and so on. But with digital cameras, we can do a lot more now and match those pictures, I hope, as precisely as possible. So that's the focus of several books that we've now done since the year about 2002. Is when our first book came out. There's my wife Camille, who designs our books. We sent them to a printer, totally self-funded, relying on readers like you, which we really appreciate. I've met several of you tonight that have our books already or bought them today, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. So tonight I'm also going to talk about these two. I'll get Yellowstone in there as well, since we're over here in Wyoming. Check out these other two on my webpage or elsewhere sometime if you'd like. But we thank our readers again for their support of our project. So I also need to mention my co-authors on the two Custer Expedition books. I don't do this all by myself. We have John Nelson there of Rapid City and Ernie Graffy, formerly of the Black Hills, but now lives out west in California near Oakland. And he comes back to the hills every summer and explores the byways and highways of the Black Hills, doing historical research and going over Custer's Trail again. So I could not have done these two books that I hope you'll enjoy if you see them without these two gentlemen. And I really got to make sure everybody understands that it's not just my work. Mostly I was involved with the photographs, as you'll see. So the book Exploring with Custer is focused mostly on the journey of this expedition while they were in the Black Hills. That was about 3 weeks. That's where a lot of the pictures were taken. So that was the focus of our efforts back in 2002 when this book first came out. Well, just last year, a year ago this past June, we reissued a completely revised 4th edition of this book, which has a little 4 in the corner there. And that is a completely new book that I'll describe in a moment. But in 2009, then, we added another book called Crossing the Plains with Custer, which covers the rest of their trail to and from the Black Hills. And I know that can be a little confusing. We just didn't have the resources to do the whole thing back in 2002, but thanks to interest in this part of the expedition, then we were able to do the second book to cover and document the rest of that trail. So what's new in the new edition here that came out a year ago are several things. We updated virtually every page in some way, not always a whole rewrite, but a lot of the facts have been updated since 20 years ago. We added 36 new pages. I went back to all the photo sites. There's about 50 of these across the Black Hills, and I re-photographed them again. Since the time I'd done it before was back in 2002, I was using film back then. It was a little less precise, a lot less precise than using digital, where I can compare on a computer while I'm sitting there and get a really good matching image. Also, this time, I was able to shoot them on the same day that the photographer did in 1874, which I spent a lot of resources doing that, and I'm very proud of that. So the lighting is the same in a lot of cases as well. And then all you're left then is what are the changes, what are the similarities, as we'll see. We also were able to scan the original glass negatives. They didn't even have a scanner at the State Archives back in 2002. And so we were copying old photo and the copies of these original photos. The glass negatives are in, most of them are in our collection in Pierce, South Dakota, at the South Dakota State Historical Society. We'll see a couple of examples of those. And we also colorize some of them just to bring them to life a little more, as I think you'll see shortly. We've got some new sources that we add to we have over 20 first-hand sources, people who were actually on this expedition, writing about their experiences, and that's what we really value, telling us what it was like back then. And we updated all the guidance. These will let you follow their trail through the Black Hills, so there's GPS data, maps, and so on. And Ernie Graffey and I went over all that about 4 years ago now, and then 2 years of getting the book ready, the revised book, and then publishing it last June. And there's been some land ownership changes. One that I'll just mention, because it's not actually in my talk, but if you're familiar with Floral Valley, that was once owned by Homestake Mining Company, about 30,000 acres. So that changed hands, I think, around 2004, 2005. Very nice man, owns all that now. And he has let us in there to do research, but it's not generally open to the public. So that area is kind of closed off, and we wanted to update that in the book as well. And we've got some new discoveries to add to this book, which I'll talk about shortly too. So I think all of you know this is 1874 we're talking about. Occasionally I talk to bus tours or whatever, and they think we're talking about the Little Bighorn, and that was a couple of years later. Obviously, that Custer had a less happy outcome on that expedition than he did in 1874. So why did this expedition even come to the Black Hills? There was talk in some of the orders early on about finding a site for a fort, maybe on the west side of the Black Hills, just north of us, maybe around Indian Cara. That kind of evaporated, but they clearly wanted to make a good map of the area because this was almost a blank spot on the map, as Ewart wrote in this diary entry. So they definitely filled in some blank spots on the map as the military, the U.S. government understood it at that time. The gold was very much on their minds as well as an unofficial reason. And one of the things they were, it's not hard to argue this was kind of a violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 that promised the Western South Dakota, the Black Hills, to the Lakota and their allies. There is some language in there, though, about government agents passing over the treaty lands, and so we can debate today whether this qualifies as under that clause or not of the Fort Laramie Treaty. But they did come down, of course, from Fort Lincoln, so we do study this history, and I get a lot of joy out of that, of course. So who's with this expedition? Well, obviously led by Custer. He's at lower left there. His horse moved a little bit during the exposure. This would have been about a 10-second exposure. Yeah, so he didn't hold still. So he's a little blurry. But we were talking at the table a minute ago. I have never taken a picture of 1,000 people, and that's what's in this photo from 1874. It's an amazing image that we're fortunate to have. So who else came along? Well, there were almost 1,000. There's 995 men listed on the roster. We have a transcript of the original roster, which has disappeared from the National Archives since the 1970s. But we're fortunate somebody made a transcript in an earlier book, so we reproduced that in one of our books. And I occasionally get a call from somebody that'll say, well, I always heard my great-great-grandfather was with Custer, and we can look on there and find their names sometimes. It's pretty cool. There was a woman named Sarah Campbell, a black woman, who worked for the sutler on this expedition. And she's quoted in some of the newspaper articles and so on that come out of this. So she's a very interesting character. There were 70 Indian scouts. These were mostly Arikara and Ree Indians who were traditional enemies of the Sioux, but they're beginning to sign up as scouts for the Army in the 1870s. And as they might see it, going against their enemy, the Sioux, by kind of invading the Black Hills with the Army. Some of the lands that they had explored in the past, the Lakota were, of course, kind of taking over western South Dakota in the 1700s, early 1800s, and forcing the Rickers and Rees back to the Missouri River. So some of these Indian scouts had been to the Black Hills, and they knew where they might find good campsites along the way, where they might find water, wood for fires, grass for all the livestock. Of course, they always needed water. So these were very important to Custer. I don't think he would have found the Black Hills without them from over 300 miles away. It would have been a much more difficult journey. There were 5 newspaper reporters writing down almost literally hour by hour every day what was going on. Anything of significance was usually reported on by at least one and sometimes multiple sources. So one of the things in the book that Ernie Graff, my co-author, did was, we got one guy writing about something here, and then somebody else writes about it here and over here, and he puts all those accounts together so you can kind of read what Custer wrote, what one of the newspaper articles wrote, what one of the the diaries or journals say, and kind of get that perspective from multiple sources. So the newspaper reports are a big part of that. There were a couple of miners along, Rachel Ross being one of them. He came back to the town of Custer that was founded after this expedition and lived there until his death in, I think, 1903. He's buried in our cemetery, but he's credited with, along with Frank McKay, discovering gold in the Black Hills on August 2nd, 1874, during this expedition. So they were looking for gold everywhere they went. They finally found what they called paying quantities near the town of Custer. There was a team of map makers under a man named Captain Ludlow. Ludlow was probably the smartest guy on this expedition, I think. He was doing survey work that we're able to still use today, as you'll see. And then several scientists studying the plants, animals, the geology, fossils, all of that going into an official report to Congress. So they weren't out here just, goofing around. They were trying to collect valuable data that the government could use. There was this photographer, William Henry Illingworth, who I owe a great debt to, and did a fantastic job with his photo wagon, had a little portable dark tent as well, and the pictures, are really amazing from that far. Here's the other photo of the wagon train they took, and this one is equal to the other in terms of showing their formation out on the prairie there. 110 covered wagons, plus a few other assorted carts and so on. And about 1,500 horses and mules. So there's about 6 mules pulling each wagon. You got roughly 700 mules, and you had some spares. 800 cavalry riding all the horses. So that's a lot of animals walking around any given campsite. Then there was also a cannon and 3 Gatling guns. So they were well armed and ready for conflict if it arose. But on this expedition, Custer was really in a different kind of frame of mind than you might typically picture him as sort of just attacking, any chance he got an Indian village or whatever, not defending anything he did earlier or later in his career. But on this expedition, from his own writing, as well as from others who wrote about it, it's pretty clear he was just trying to explore the Black Hills. Those were his orders, and he was following that. And he kind of went out of his way not to alarm some of what they discovered up in the Black Hills by present-day Deerfield Lake. And I'll save that story for another time, but it's pretty interesting dynamic going on there at this time. And then just to keep things light and interesting, we had a 16-piece brass band. And we can actually see one of the band members in this photo. If you there he is with his tuba ready. So the band would perform apparently in the morning. Sometimes as camp was being set up. They definitely perform. Picture this wagon train going through the Black Hills, just heading up some random gully that you drive by on your way to Custer. And think of the work to cut down the trees, to move boulders, and so on. A lot of that was done. They were almost building a road as they went in some places. And when the men were laboring, then the band would perform for them to keep their job a little later. So this is where they all came from. Fort Abraham Lincoln up in present-day North Dakota. That was the frontier at that time, about 300 miles, 350 from the Black Hills. And it looks like this today. It's a state park where they've started to rebuild some of the buildings that were torn down back in the 1890s when the fort was abandoned. That's Custer's home there, which has been reconstructed from plans and photographs on the Missouri River, of course. It's a wonderful state park. If you're interested in this history, it's a great place to go get some interpretation. I was speaking with someone earlier today about this, as well as they have a lot of man-made or riprap earth lodges and artifacts, and it's just a great place for a trip. So that's way up in present-day North Dakota. They left there on July 2nd, 1874. Took this route, the red dot arrows. They kind of hit the Black Hills about July 20th. Here's where they cross into Wyoming. On July 18th, I believe it was, 18th through about the 23rd, 4th, excuse me, they were, in Wyoming, and then they curved into the Black Hills from the west and down Flora Valley and so on. And I'll talk about a couple of the events that happened there in this part of the trek. I'll just say in Wyoming a little later. I kind of jumped that one a little faster. Let me just go back. So then they ended up camping where the town of Custer is for 2 nights, August 30th and 31st, and then 3 miles east of Custer, August 1 through 5. So they were in that area of the town of Custer for about a week. And that's the longest they stayed in any one place. Most of the time it was just overnight camps. They did camp for 2 nights up by Indian Kara Mountain, north of us, which we'll touch on in a moment here. And then they headed back about August 6th. They're beginning their trail back, and they get back to Fort Lincoln by August 30th. So they're on the trail about 2 months. They're only in the Black Hills for 3 weeks at that time. The rest of the time they're coming and going, which is why we did another book about that earlier.
The new store. This is the one-stop shop. We have a pharmacy. We have a bootlegger's liquor. The deli, the food that you can get at a lunchtime is so amazing. The coffee shop. Certain Friday mornings, there's 30 people sitting here in all these chairs. This is the hub for people to come and visit, have their coffee, have their donuts. It's amazing what this area has done. Totally amazing.
They're only in the Black Hills for 3 weeks at that time. The rest of the time they're coming and going, which is why we did another book about that earlier. That part of the expedition. We know all this, or I think we put this together, we hope accurately, thanks to these maps that fold out of the official government report that Ludlow published in 1875. He did 3 maps, a geology map, and a map of their whole route, and then a map of the Black Hills as they understood it at the time, which we'll look at in detail here. So if you scan this in, magnify it on the computer, use a magnifying glass, you start to see things that maybe you could recognize, like Harney's Peak, as they call it, Black Elk Peak. Now, their elevations were not always accurate. They thought that was 9,700 feet. They were having some trouble with their barometer and didn't get totally accurate elevations. But the rest of it, showing the track of the wagon train coming into the valley where the town of Custer is now, the date of the camp, the date of this camp where they stayed for 5 days. So pretty accurate. And they also took a trip up Black Elk Peak that we'll see shortly, which is also quite accurate. In addition to the map, then we're looking at the written sources, and do the written sources agree with what the map, what Ernie and I thought the map was telling us about where did they actually travel with the wagon train. And so we've got a diary from Winchell here, the geologist of the expedition, University of Minnesota, and he did some sketches. This one is dated July 30th, 1874. We know what date he was sketching in his book that day, his diary. And it says Granite Hills outline looking east. And we look at the map, and on that date, they'd come from this way, they'd come in like this. So we're back along this section of the trail looking for any sign of, what he was sketching. It wasn't very hard to find once we realized, what we were looking at. This is Buckhorn Mountain, north of Custer. Driving from Custer to Crazy Horse Memorial, you see this out the right side of your car on the east side of the highway there. I can actually see these rocks from my house at a distance. That's one of the reasons I got interested in this. The idea that that whole wagon train went by right there. I can actually see this every day when I'm driving to town, So it brings it home when you realize it's kind of in your backyard. We have these wonderful images or stereographs, as the photographer called them, of the Black Hills. There's about 55 of them in his set. That photo I showed you, the wagon train, I enlarged from one of these. That's how big they are, roughly their actual size. And he was using a camera that would have looked something like this. We don't have his camera, but this is in a museum. A stereo camera made of wood. You just took the lens caps off to take a picture. You didn't have a shutter. You just take them off, count to 10, put them back on, or whatever the exposure might have been for the conditions he was in. He's shooting on glass, a wet plate process it was called. and taking two pictures side by side at the same time in stereo. So he's going to print these then to these stereo view cards. There's the glass negative as seen in the State Archives in Pierce, South Dakota. They're about 8 inches long, 4.5 inches wide, or tall. So when you do scan these in, there really is a lot of detail and information. But when he printed them, he was cropping them a little bit. We like to see that whole, we want the whole picture, right? And so this is kind of what we were using back in 2002. But more recently now we've been able to get these scans of the negatives, which give us a little more information. So I was trying to match, another reason for having the glass negative, occasionally on the very edge of the card, so a name into that. This says Hidden Wood Camp, and that's the name of the photo, the camp that they stayed at on that particular night, which was July 8th of 1874. This camp was just over the border in present-day North Dakota, between Henninger and Lemon, South Dakota, Henninger, North Dakota. So actually on July 8th, this was a few years ago now, I was on that spot and got permission from the landowner. This is on a private ranch, and took a picture. I was a little worried because as the sun set, and I was trying to match the lighting on the same day, right? You know, the sun is at a certain angle, but you can see the light going across, and the leg of my tripod was kind of starting to creep into the shot, and I'll have to rearrange that. But then I get to looking at the full frame. My hair's good. Well, I guess I wasn't in the right spot. So, but that's part of the fun of doing this. Occasionally you come across some kind of connection like that. I don't claim any physical or spiritual or otherwise connection to Edward, but being in the same spot as he was in is quite interesting at times. So beautiful shot of the whole camp, all the wagons parked in the middle, kind of a protective square. We assume that most of their camps were set up more or less like this. We do have some other photos that show some of their camps in the Black Hills, and occasionally they were forced into valleys and corners and so on. But out on the prairie, I think they use this kind of thing pretty much. So here's Illinois, 1842 to 1893. I met one of his descendants in St. Paul, Minnesota, many years ago now. He's passed on now, William Burlingame. But he had these portraits of Illinois at different times during his life from a family album that has since is now at the Minnesota Historical Society. But the portraits are all really we have of Illingworth at work. We did collaborate to place this marker on Illingworth's grave up in Minnesota, the Oakland Cemetery. The coordinates are in our book, so you can go visit that if you want to find that. It mentions the expedition in the Black Hills. And then Illingworth was also on the Fisk expedition in Montana in 1866 as a very young man with another photographer. We think that's how he kind of got his experience with photography on the trail, so to speak. So there's a lot of history there as well. Well, he shot a few pictures on the prairie, as we saw, the one of the camp, the wagon trains, but most of his shots were in the Black Hills. And you could argue, I think this is the first Black Hills photo ever taken. This is west of Aladdin. It's on private property. I think the Wayland zone. I don't know if that rings a bell to anybody or their neighbor. I forget now, but we got permission, believe me, from all parties. And actually, one of them, as it says in our book, showed us the photo site. They identified this rock formation, which was really a big help because trees have grown in a lot of places where they weren't back in 1874. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit. It's not a blanket statement that there's always more trees and/or that we need more logging everywhere, but there are places where there are more trees than there were in 1874, as you see very obviously here. I'm not sure why he took that photo. The camp was over here to his left. We know where the camp was. And he actually had a title on this picture that says "View from our first camp in the hills." I kind of wonder if he didn't lose a negative or break a negative and then ended up printing this with the title that he'd come up with. But in any case, this is not his greatest work, but it's an interesting photo nonetheless. And then next, a little later, he went into Floral Valley. This is the area that's used to be Homestake. Similar kind of a thing with a rock. The trees have grown up here a little bit, but they're much younger. But the valley is still there, as you can kind of see in the background. I kind of jumped over this here because I'm going to come back to it. I said we don't have any photos of him actually working with his camera. It wasn't quite true. We had a shadow working with his camera, right? So there's the leg of his tripod again. The black cloth over his head, I don't know. I believe this is him holding the plate holder. You had to pull out a dark slide and then hold it while you counted to 10 and put the dark slide back in. So I think that's what's going on there. So this is, of course, I mean, we're just to our north of about 20 miles or something like that, between here and Sundance, Wyoming. You can see this easily from, I think it's Highway 585. So this isn't at their camp. On the day this was taken, July 23rd, Custer General and a couple companies of cavalry were riding to the top of the mountain. They were hoping to see a route into the Black Hills, but it was very smoky that day. Does that sound familiar? They really couldn't see very far, but they often did this. They would climb the high points near their route so they could get an idea what the lay of the land was, literally the lay of the land, and aid in the map making that Ludlow was doing. This is also on a private ranch. Again, lots of helpful landowners out there. And July 23rd, about 7:30 in the morning is when your shadow will stretch out like the Whitworths did back in 1874. So this was in 2020. I mentioned earlier, I shot all these again, for the updated version of our book on the same day. I was trying to get the same time of day when I could. So I set this up actually the day before. I wanted to make sure I was completely ready and left the tripod just sitting there and the cows would knock it over and get back out the next morning. But so yeah, it's an awesome photo site. There's some other stuff going on here having to do with stuff that's in the picture. We don't quite know maybe what that is. But if you go out to the site, you will sometimes see these same dead tree laying there. It's tipped away from the camera. You're looking at the roots kind of sticking up in the air there. And it's even a little polished, and I'm sure the cows rub on it, but I'm also pretty sure buffalo probably rubbed on this. We know it's 150 years old, and it could be a lot older than that, as we will see this next photo site. So I'm skipping over, there's about 50 of these. We won't go through all of them tonight, but some of the more interesting ones, including this beautiful shot of the wagons coming down what's called the Castle Creek Valley, named on this expedition for these castle-like formations that they would see above them as they went through. Try not to digress into too many stories here, but I want to emphasize what Ernie Graffy did with the writing that people did goes with the photos very well. You got this picture and you're like, okay, here come the wagons. Well, when you look at the wagons, actually a lot of them are just parked. They're not moving, they're just sitting there. Well, why are they sitting there? Well, if you go over to the written sources, and on this day, July 26th, they say, okay, we're going down the Castle Creek Valley. We got bogged down in basically a beaver dam was filling the valley, the width of the valley. So they had to get around that somehow. They're building a bridge and doing whatever they needed to do to get the wagons through. But it took about 4 hours, so they're killing time. And you can kind of imagine Illingworth with his wagon saying, well, I've got some time now. I'll go up to that rock I can see above us. And maybe I can make a picture of that. And it's a stunning photo that he did take. So this is July 26th. I really liked how the sun kind of went under the clouds a little bit. And it really matched up the lighting really well. And that's what I was kind of working on. So, let's see. I can go on about that, but I'll say that. There are some trees in these photos as well, snags or burnt stumps. And people have remarked on this since the 1970s. SDSU over in Brookings, South Dakota, did a book where they have this picture and others, and that was also a model for our work that I often need to credit. But we were trying to take that a little farther, and how old are these trees? That's the same trees, just kind of leaning a little bit. So a guy I know from the Forest Service, Wayne Cook, he's retired now, but he had the authority to look around the area there, and if you just turn around from the photo site, you see other stumps or snags that look just like the ones in front. And what's happened here, there was a fire, and then you know, in the last X 100, 200, whatever number of years, the forest has grown up around these survivors of that fire. So he cut one of those that's not in the picture. We didn't want to cut ones in the picture down. He cut a similar snag down, and it's on display in the Forest Service office up in Custer, if you want to stop in there and look at it. There it is, and there's a slice they took out of it. They sent these to a lab down in Colorado, and they did some tree ring data dating on it, and they found that that tree sprouted in 1418. The outer rings date to 1570. Now they burned, you know, it was this big, and then it burned down to, you know, 1570. So if that's true, it may have died in a 1685 fire. It's been standing there for 340 years. It's 605 years old. So we assume these are a similar age structure to them. And I'm kind of wondering if the ones out on the prairie that we looked at could be similar in age as well. I've been all over. I've been in the Grand Canyon doing this kind of work. Lots of places where there's a dead tree standing there, and it's still there, you know, 150 years later. You really do start to wonder what the limits might be. These are pitch pine. I should have mentioned that. I bet some of you are familiar with that. Ranchers will take this stuff to make fence posts because it's so resistant to decay and rot. It's very rigid and hard. It's not petrified, but it does work well for that. Well, this is a photo I took in 2002 on the right, and you can see that back then the forest was definitely overgrown back then, almost choked with small pine trees. And then we had this thing called the mountain pine needle come in. So this is the photo I took in 2020 near that same location. You're still seeing remnants of the mountain pine needle, even though that ended about 2018 or so up in the Black Hills. But the forest in this area, at least, had kind of returned to almost what it looked like back in 1874. I kept backing up and I realized, okay, that's the same rock there. So now I'm looking at the same photo site and really getting a good view. Back in 2002, I shot that other photo from way down in here because there were so many trees, I couldn't see anything. I was just like, you know, it's just a wall of trees. So really, I had to kind of guess. And again, I was using film back then as well. Well, this map here is just kind of showing the route that Custer and probably about 100 soldiers took up to Black Elk Peak or Harney's Peak, as they called it. Again, they're trying to climb the high points. So once they get up there, the idea would be that Ludlow could take his I'm sorry, not his sextant, somebody help me out here. He's taking bearings on other peaks, Bear Butte, Custer Peak, and then he ties that all together as he puts his map together. So he's up. So they're trying to get up to the top of Black Elk Peak, but they have a lot of trouble doing that. They get to what they think is the summit, and they can see it up above them. And they get there and realize there's a taller hill that they still need to climb. So they get to number 2. For this revision. And what we didn't have 20 years ago was Google Earth. Now we have this tool that anybody can kind of get on there and start looking at things like, well, what are these rocks? I've never noticed those before. And they're within the campsite, or within the town site of Custer. So mark these with my GPS, get out in the field, on the ground, and start looking at all these different rock formations around town. Not sure if I would find anything or not. But I walked up to this, and I mean, I was texting my co-operating Rafi within about 5 minutes. You know, I think this could be it. The Mickelson Trail, the bike trail, which was a railroad line, of course, built in 1891, it goes right by there. It may have damaged this area, I'm not sure, but the tent is kind of hiding that. These rocks look very similar. There's lots of pine needles. I mean, I don't know if you have ponderosa pine in your yard, but they will bury stuff in a couple of years as the pine needles come down if you don't break them up. So I'm thinking that could have changed it. I'm not positive this is the spot, but this is what we put in the book. There is this interesting tree here, which if it's the same one, has been cut down long ago. It has a similar
kind of the shape there, the sweep to the right, and it's in about the right position, I think, to match up if you're in this position. So this is under the control of our game fish and parks, and I worked with an archaeologist, a federally licensed archaeologist, to write them a letter and ask any chance of doing a test lot. The answer was no. I don't know if it'll always be no. We're kind of working on that as we get time, but that would verify if this was the spot, I think, because I'm almost positive there would be remnants of the camp there. But that remains to be seen. Well, these are just a few other photos taken in the Custer area. The Needles Highway is off in the distance here, so that's the Needles, the Cathedral Spires. We went to some pretty high points. We went to some lower areas. Mountain Pine Needle here again, remnants of that left over. This is on Calamity Peak, which is about 3 miles east of Custer. That's the same tree, just kind of leaning over now after 150 years. This is also the same tree, still growing onto that rock. It's about maybe 2 feet taller now after 150 years. Pretty cool to see. Another thing about getting scans of these negatives as opposed to copy prints, we started seeing that he actually did record clouds in his pictures. If you look at any old photo from the 1800s, in almost any book, the sky is always white. That's because it was massively overexposed compared to the foreground. But using digital, Photoshop, not adding anything, there's no AI here, we're just darkening that sky enough to show what was there in the shadow, and that's what we're seeing. Another interesting site on Calamity Peak, there's the camp off in the distance where they stayed for 5 days in August of 1874. Same tree here, just a little bigger, and this is just 3 miles east of Custer, South Dakota. You can drive right through that area. This one's a lot easier to get to. Again, some of the camp off in the distance, horses grazing here, the same rock formation in the foreground. You often had something in the foreground to give it a stereo effect. When you look at these in stereo using one of those old-time stereo viewers, you get a very much 3D effect because of something like that in the foreground. Looking down over the camp now, so that this is Calamity Peak where some of the other pictures were taken. There's Blackout Peak off in the distance. The previous photo was taken from right here. We crossed this valley, climbed another peak, and now we're looking down across the campsite with Black Elk in the background. And Highway 16A, the town of Custer is over this way. Custer State Park is off this way about a half a mile. Near Stockade Lake, if you know that area of the Black Hills. And you can literally camp where Custer camped there at that RV park. So want to check that out if you're up in the area. Well, this awesome photo, then again, Custer with this grizzly bear. And we colorized this for the book also, as you'll see. The photo shows several other people, all of whom shot the bear, according to a couple of sources. But we don't know who got most of the credit. This is a guy named Bloody Knife. He's Custer's chief Indian scout. An Arikara half-breed Sioux who hated the Sioux, couldn't wait to fight the Sioux, and was killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn, fighting alongside Custer's troops a couple of years later. And of course, Custer, this is Private Noonan, who was Custer's orderly that day. He was not at the Little Bighorn. Captain Ludlow was the mapmaker I mentioned, also escaped the Little Bighorn. He was on other duty up on the Canadian border, I believe, surveying the border up there. So this awesome photo, which we found this photo site back in 2002 using Ludlow's map. Ludlow's map showed us where the campsite of August 7th was, and we knew that was the camp where the photo was taken because the written sources, everybody wrote about the grizzly bear being shot. All the newspaper reporters, all the diaries, Custer, of course, wrote about it, and they put the date on there, August 7th. So we knew it was at that campsite, and that's what led us eventually to those rock formations on private property about 2 miles north of Rochford, South Dakota, if you're familiar with that area. Well, they had some other adventures getting out of the Black Hills. They went through Custer Gap. They exited the hills north of Black Hawk, South Dakota, and then camped south of Bear Butte up on the northeastern corner before beginning their journey back. We don't have a photo of that campsite, but we do have a nice picture of Bear View. Well, just turning back to the book again, just to kind of give you an idea of what's been updated, we did add a couple of pages from a Lakota scholar, a woman who asked, we talked, and she wrote a piece about what the Black Hills meant to the Lakota. I thought that was a fair thing to add to this discussion. We're not rewriting history, just getting another voice in the book. We did find some areas where we believe, now that the pine beetle kind of cleared the forest a little bit, we see some ruts. These are huge grooves, not ruts like you picture in sandstone where you can see where each wheel went, but these grooves that run for hundreds of feet in some cases. And we think these originated on the expedition because they're right on the route that Ludlow mapped. They were probably used by many other travelers in the years after that. In fact, Annie Talent, who was with the Gordon Stockade Party in 1874, said literally, she wrote, we followed Custer's ruts all the way to French Creek where they had found gold, and then we started looking for gold there. So it's clear they were used by others. Well, I've added a few slides here, pardon me while I just make sure I'm kind of staying on time here. This is at the beginning of the book, How to Use the Sky. This is all Wyoming here, and much of this is as well. I know you can't take that all in here, but this book, Exploring with Custer, starts on July 20th up by Aladdin, Wyoming. That's where we pick up the expedition trail coming into the Black Hills. I put these slides in just to share some stuff with you about your locality here. Up in Indian Cara, we're driving to Sundance. You may have noticed a picket fence off on the right side of the road with a couple of graves in it. I don't know, anybody know what I'm talking about at all? Okay, great. So that's what these are, the grave site of two soldiers, one of whom was killed by another in a very brief gunfight, and one of them forgot his gun. That's why he got killed. That's what happened. He was starting it. And then the other died of apparently dysentery, lack of fluids, poor conditions, bad food, whatever you want to call it. Turner and Cunningham are buried in those graves. I don't know personally when those stones were placed, but probably in the 50s, 1950s. But the reason that says the mysteries of the graves, and I'm not going to be able to go through all of this, but this is all new material in the new edition that I thought might interest you in particular. I will say this site now, the landowner and manager are not crazy about people going up there. There probably are keep out signs. The UTVs have driven them nuts. That's all I can say. The UTVs drive up to it, drive around the grave, back to the road, and so he got tired of it and finally kind of like, and so he's a really nice man. Some of you probably know what I'm talking about, and he will let people go up that are interested. I just want to make sure you all know about that, because I'm sorry to report that, but that's what has happened. So what happened that day? 3 in the afternoon, my company was on rear guard. We came to a spring right at the main trail, but found that everybody else had trampled it, made its water nearly unfit for drinking. Nevertheless, with dried and nearly blackened tongues, we drank water, dirt, sand, bugs, grass, anything to alleviate the terrible raging thirst. That's Ewart. And he's in good condition. Cunningham was the one that died of dysentery. He was already sick, riding in an ambulance, and half dead already. So that's why he probably died that day on this segment of the journey, and then was buried that evening, 8 o'clock the next morning. And they described the whole funeral. They were sewn into, it was just before sundown, sewed in canvas, got everybody lined up, they sang, 3 volleys were fired, light of a lantern, the funeral service was read. So they took it very seriously. They did bury them there. There's no question of that. The question we had was, is the gravesite today where they were buried? And a guy named C.C. O'Hara from the School of Mines in the 1930s was doing work on this expedition trail 50 years after Custer had been here. He was studying the history, looking back on it. And long story short, he found a bone. He found an arm bone. And that convinced him that one grave was over there and one grave was here.
In In addition to the weekly printed version of the newsletter journal, we also promote our community and share important information on our award-winning website, newslj.com, and in our weekly email newsletter, Nuke Now. We also connect with readers through various social media platforms and invite you to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can even take a look at a recent meeting of the City Council, School Board, or County Commission on our YouTube channel. We do hope that you will go to newslj.com and subscribe today, and we look forward to making all of our great content available to you. But regardless of your level of support, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for doing your part to preserve a free and independent local press.
Long story short, he found a bone. He found an arm bone, and that convinced him that one grave was over there and one grave was here. And he documented that. This is one guy standing by one bone. These guys are standing by the other grave. That's the site where the graves are today. This is where the guy found the other arm bone. The arm bone went back to, and I'm summarizing a lot of stuff here, back to the School of Mines, got put in a box, forgotten about, and then in the 1980s, they're supposed to repatriate all these bones in museums. They find this bone, and say, okay, we gotta bury this, what is it? Okay, Custer Expedition, C.C. O'Hare picked it up, and they end up burying it in a grave over by Piedmont, because that's where the state of South Dakota had set up a site for burial of remains that they didn't know what else to do with, such as Indian bones that were not claimed by anyone. There you go, it's all right here in the book. When you get a chance to read this, in 2000, they deaccessioned it for reburial. So, there they are, there's the grave site. This is over by Piedmont on the other side of the Black Hills. And the terrible, terrible joke is, this guy never made it to the Black Hills, but his arm finally did. He's buried within view of where the expedition went by on the way out of the Black Hills. It's quite astounding. You could have seen the wagons from this hill just looking across towards Piedmont. But in any case, you can't make it. I've always said you cannot make up stranger stuff that actually happens in history. I kind of went through that really fast. There is more in the book about it. We have another grave site up by Nemo Road. A guy died up there and was buried, and that grave is in the right spot for sure. Private land, but he welcomes visitors. This is new material in the book. We have the carving that's on top of Indian Cara. We have a carving that's near the town of Custer. This is a 1962 photo of it. This is more recently. It's getting worn because so many people touch it. What we have not done in our books is say exactly where these carvings are. That's all we can do as authors to try to preserve that. But, obviously local history, you're interested in that. There is a carving on top of Indian Cara, and there are ways to figure out where that is if you don't know already. But we didn't put it in the book for the masses on Facebook and everything to share. But a number of other good photos. We also tried to encompass most of the museums that have displays or artifacts about the Custer Expedition around the Black Hills. So those are in the book. Some of these are things that either I found or other people that we know found at expedition camps, which have been donated to those museums. Again, just these two books kind of go together. I am going to just touch on this book a little bit. Crossing the Plains, we brought in John Nelson. We went to the National Archives. We found the original map that they had drawn back in 1874. We learned about things like their odometer card, which measured mileage between the campsites so that we know how far it is from one camp to the other. They're keeping track of that. They took latitude readings with a sextant and longitude readings with a chronometer of all of their campsites. So that information that went into this table, it's in the official report that I mentioned, and every day they wrote down what's the name of the camp, what time did we leave, what time did we arrive at the next camp, what's the thermometer, barometer, latitude, longitude, how far did we go today, 16.9, 24, 13, they're adding it up. We went about 1,326 miles altogether, I think. But that information then let us map out what we thought was the correct trail out on the prairie, especially. In the Black Hills, it's reasonably obvious. They're in the valley. They're not up on that mountain, right? But on the plains, they could be anywhere. So, again, I'm summarizing 5 years or so, but we started putting their map onto Google Earth, which again, we were just starting to use, and figuring out where these campsites were from Fort Lincoln. That's the Ludlow map from 1874 on Google Earth, heading for the Black Hills, and then coming back again this way. And these are all places where they camped and so on. We talked to landowners who were always interested in the history. Some of them had no idea. They're like, Custer, he was in Montana, you guys are way out there. Well, this was going to the Black Hills. Some of them had found things they couldn't explain, like eagle buttons, horseshoes, when they're plowing the back 40. And some of them gave us permission to use metal detectors when the crops were off the fields. We were trying to find a camp like the one in that picture, except we don't have a picture of this camp, so we don't know where it is exactly. But we begin scanning and scanning and scanning and digging up barbed wire and bottle caps and tools the rancher dropped and all kinds of stuff. And then perhaps under the grass, finding something like this, which is an actual 45-55 cartridge of the right kind that they were using in 1874, or maybe some square nails or that sort of thing. Agriculture, it's the way the world is gradually damaging some of these things. This has been hit by a plow, but also weathering and rust and, just for time. And no one else is out there doing this, so we're just a couple of guys, but we have permission. I want to emphasize on private property with permission of the landowners, not on the national forest, digging around. That's, I just want to be clear about that because there are some regulations. We do find horseshoes, and maybe there's a reason, and mule shoes. There's 1,500 horses and mules. That's 6,000 shoes walking around any one camp. And if they change the shoes, say, 3 or 4 times in a couple of months, 24,000 or more shoes laying out on the prairie. So keep your eyes open when you're out there. That's all I can say. There are more of them out there. We found maybe a couple of dozen altogether. But that's what's in our Crossing the Plains book, are some of these artifacts that have been found, including, I might add, remnants of champagne bottles as well as beer bottles. This is beer from Dublin and from England. Those were imported, taken to Fort Lincoln, put on a wagon, hauled to the Black Hills, and drank. Believe it or not. These are not from the drinking party site. These are from campsites up in probably most of North Dakota. But a lot of interesting things you would not expect. The rest of the book just kind of shows what the terrain looks like. We know they went right through here. They might have been here, they might have been here, but they definitely went by at this location based on their map on July 4th, 1874. So take a look at that book. I only brought about 8 copies with me. I have some postcards you can order online or whatever if I do run out. And well, Lucas asked me just to mention briefly some other work I've done in Wyoming. And if you weren't familiar with it, we did do a book on Yellowstone. I worked with a guy, Bob Berry, over in Cody, Wyoming, who's been collecting historic photos of Yellowstone for 40 years. And so we went around the park and did about 100 locations like this, where you can see some of the same themes as in the Black Hills. There's those trees. Those have fallen over actually now. This is about 8 years ago, or 10 years ago, up at Mammoth Hot Springs in the north part of the park. I got around the park. I had not spent time in Yellowstone, but I did for this project over a couple of summers, trying to get to each of these particular locations and seeing what had changed or stayed the same. The road systems that have been changed. The highway is way up here. They used to have this corkscrew bridge that's on the Sylvan Pass coming in from Cody, Wyoming. And of course, Old Faithful and Old Faithful Inn. I do some book signings there every summer now, which is kind of ironic, but it's kind of enjoyable to go out there and talk to people. And then some places, because this is a national park, that are so well preserved, I can hardly believe it. This looks exactly the same as it did back in 1878. So we're fortunate to have that ethic in this country to preserve some of these public lands. And there's some great wild geysers. There's GPS coordinates for every photo I show tonight. Unless it's on public or private property, you can navigate to this spot, and it's only a mile or 2 off from the parking lot, and enjoy that geyser on your own. So that's Yellowstone yesterday and today. So I'm wrapping up here. I do not about Facebook, and I'm not recommending anybody join Facebook. But if you're on Facebook and you want to see what I'm doing, please follow. I struck a chord there, didn't I? Oh, you know, it has its purposes, but it drives me crazy. Anyway, I also have a website. If you order on my website as opposed to Amazon, I personally fill the order, sign the book, ship it to you, and you're helping us out a lot there. So I appreciate that. Just pricing here a little bit. It's confusing, and I try to make it simple, but I always fail. The new edition in hardcover is a signed and numbered limited edition. So that means that we took all 1,000 copies out of the box. My wife wrote very neatly a number like 569 out of 1,000, and then Ernie Graffin, my co-author, signed it, and then I signed it, and we put it back in the box and take them up again, and we're gradually selling these. I don't have the beer out quite yet, but so that one is $99 because of all of that work. The soft cover is $49, which I think is a bargain, and then I'm offering these for $20 off. I've only got about, I don't know, 7 or 8 of them left, but I'll ship you one if we run out. Talk to me about that. And then I do have the Yellowstone book back there, a few copies of that. So take a postcard if you don't get one tonight. You want to get one later. I've got some back there. Yeah, that's thanks for the sale, the sales pitch there. I appreciate your attention tonight. Thank you again for having me over. Thank you. My last then and now, 1980 and today. So I don't know, yeah, we should just let people get up. I'll be glad to take questions or comments or talk to you back at the table, especially if those lights come back there. Thank you. Oh, thank you much.
The ones that start slow, but boy, by mid-season, you see something, and by the end of the year, they're the scary team nobody wants to play. Those are more fun than the teams that come in that you know are going to dominate, and they are dominating. You know, you're almost afraid to lose when you've got really, really good teams and high expectations.
Oh, for sure.
Those are fun seasons. Is there that potential in Doggy Sports this year for some of those programs?
I think it's possible. You know, Cody coming down into 3A this year is going to scare quite a few of us old 3Ers, but we do have that potential for growth. We are not coming in at the beginning of the season at our highest potential, which frankly, you don't want. You want your team to grow. You want your team to develop and then get to that point by the end of the season to have that shot at postseason play. And